This isn't just a video, it's a piece of a bigger story we're still uncovering. Stay with us, subscribe. A Belgian administrator sits at a wooden table in the hills of Rwanda, Burundi, with a pair of calipers in his hand. He is measuring the width of a nose. He writes a number in a ledger. Beside the nose measurement, he writes another number. How many cattle the man in front of him owns. 10 head of cattle or more, certain facial proportions, a longer neck, and a clerk stamps a card that will decide which category this man belongs to for the rest of his life, and for his children's lives after him. This happened in the 1930s, across what is now Rwanda and Burundi. It was not ancestry testing. There was no laboratory involved, no science in the modern sense. Just a ruler, a cattle count, and a colonial bureaucracy that needed its subject population sorted into columns. The cards this system produced are now widely blamed, by historians, by human rights reports, by documentary after documentary, for manufacturing a division that didn't previously exist in this rigid form. The standard line, repeated at conferences and in genocide prevention literature for 3 decades, is simple. There was no real difference. It was invented. A colonial fiction, stamped onto paper, then weaponized. First in Burundi's own mass killings in 1972, and again in 1993, and next door in Rwanda in 1994. That is the story most people are told. It is clean. It is morally satisfying. It assigns blame in exactly one direction. Here is where it gets complicated. In 2015, a team of researchers ran Y chromosome analysis. Think of it as a genetic surname passed down father to son, unchanged for dozens of generations, a lineage marker rather than a blueprint for any trait, on a set of samples drawn specifically from Burundi. Not a general Great Lakes region pool, not Rwandan proxies standing in for their neighbors. Burundian Tutsi, Burundian Hutu, Burundian Twa, tested side by side, from the same country, under the same study. One particular marker turned up in nearly a quarter of the men in one of those 3 groups. It turned up in 0 men in the other 2. If the whole divide was drawn by a Belgian ruler and a cattle count, why does a 2015 genetic study find a marker in nearly a quarter of one Burundian group's men, and in exactly none of their neighbors? Before we get to that number, it helps to know what the accepted history actually says these 3 groups are, because the consensus version is more careful, more nuanced, and considerably more interesting than colonizers invented it out of nothing. Burundi sits in Africa's Great Lakes region, a landscape of terraced hills above Lake Tanganyika. 3 population groups make up its people, all speaking Kirundi today, a Bantu language. The Twa are considered the oldest population in the region, forest-dwelling foragers, genetically linked to Central African populations, sometimes called pygmy groups, present in these hills long before farming or cattle herding arrived at all. Bantu-speaking agriculturalists, the ancestors broadly of today's Hutu, expanded into the Great Lakes somewhere between roughly 700 and 1500 CE, clearing forest, planting crops, building permanent settlements. Cattle-herding pastoralist groups, the ancestors broadly of today's Tutsi, arrived in overlapping waves after that, but the mainstream historical model insists they didn't conquer as outsiders. They integrated. By the 16th century, organized kingdoms existed across the region, including Burundi's own kingdom, ruled not simply by Tutsi, but by a separate princely class called the Ganwa, a detail that already complicates any clean 2-group story. The consensus that hardened after 1994 goes further still. Hutu and Tutsi, in this telling, were never separate ethnicities in any biological sense. Same language, same religion, same clans in many cases. Centuries of intermarriage. The scholar Mahmoud Mamdani, whose work on the region is widely cited, has documented at least 4 competing historical narratives about Hutu and Tutsi origins circulating within the region's own political discourse. Evidence, supporters of this view argue, that the ethnic label was always more flexible, more socially constructed, than fixed ancestry could ever be. Under this framework, Tutsi and Hutu function closer to economic classes, cattle owner versus farmer, than to bloodlines. And the Twa, in this same telling, sit almost entirely outside the conversation, roughly 1% of Burundi's population today, excluded from land ownership, excluded from political power, rarely mentioned at all in the Hutu-Tutsi framing that dominates the history. This is the polished version, the one that gets repeated at UN briefings, the one built in part as a direct corrective to the horror that colonial-era racial thinking helped produce. But if it really is just a social costume, no biological seam anywhere underneath it, there's a question the consensus story tends to skip past quickly. Why could a colonial officer, standing in a village with nothing but a ruler and a cattle ledger, sort people by sight with any consistency at all? Height, build, facial structure. These traits tracked closely enough, often enough, that an outsider with crude tools could make a call in seconds. A pure social fiction, invented in a bureaucrat's office, doesn't usually leave a physical signature a stranger can read on a stranger's face. Researchers noticed something was off long before DNA sequencing existed to explain it. As early as 1969, physical anthropology data showed that Tutsi and related Hema pastoralist populations carried adult lactose tolerance, the ability to digest milk sugar past childhood, at levels resembling European populations, while neighboring Bantu majority groups were largely lactose deficient as adults. This wasn't a one-off finding. Geneticist Sarah Tishkoff's 2007 research on lactase persistence across the African continent mapped several independent origins of the lactose tolerance mutation, each one tied to a specific pastoralist lineage with a long history of cattle dependence. Regionally, roughly 3/4 of adult Tutsi in Rwanda and Burundi show this high lactose digestion trait. Among the neighboring Shi people of eastern Congo, the figure sits at around 5%. 3/4, 5%. That gap tracks with a cattle-herding lifestyle, not with Bantu versus non-Bantu language grouping, which is the axis the pure social construction story tends to lean on. Then comes the Y chromosome data. Trombetta and colleagues, publishing in 2015, identified the E1B1B haplogroup, specifically a subtype called M293, a lineage marker associated with southern Cushitic and pastoralist populations of eastern Africa, in 22.2% of a Tutsi sample drawn from Burundi. In the Hutu sample from that same study, from that same country, 0%. In the Twa sample, also 0%. Not a gradient, not a slow fade from one group into the next. Clean, absolute, unexpected. Earlier work had already pointed in this direction. Escoffier and colleagues, back in 1987, argued that Tutsi and related Hema populations sit genetically closer to Cushitic and Ethio-Semitic populations, broadly, lineages linked to the Horn of Africa, than a purely local Bantu population would be expected to. And there's a third thread, a medical one, among Rwandan Hutu, the sickle cell trait, a genetic adaptation that offers some resistance to malaria, appears at frequencies similar to neighboring populations who've spent long stretches in malaria-prone lowlands. Among Rwandan Tutsi, that trait is almost entirely absent. Different disease exposure over generations. Possibly a different ancestral geography entirely. Researchers are careful to frame all of this as a matter of probability and population-level pattern, not a verdict on any single individual's ancestry. Genetics describes tendencies across groups, not identity cards for people. But taken together, the data force an uncomfortable revision of the tidy post-1994 consensus. If Tutsi ancestry in Burundi carries a real, measurable, non-trivial signal tied to Horn of Africa pastoralist lineages, appearing in the Y chromosome data, in the lactase data, in the disease resistance data, then the version of the story insisting there is no biological threat at all, zero signal, pure invention top to bottom, isn't the whole truth either. Something real appears to sit underneath the social category. That doesn't make the category itself fixed or ancient or a justification for anything that colonial administrators or later regimes did with it. But it does mean the comfortable answer, it was all fiction, doesn't survive contact with the data cleanly. So if there is a real signal sitting underneath a socially fluid, politically weaponized category, where did it actually come from, and how old is it? The first theory says it came from outside, that a distinct pastoralist population migrating into the Great Lakes from the north or northeast became the biological ancestors of today's Tutsi, a genuinely separate lineage layered on top of the region's Bantu farming base. This is, in its outline, the old Hamitic hypothesis that colonial administrators leaned on directly, using it to justify treating Tutsi as a more advanced, more externally descended population, the same logic that put a ruler in a Belgian officer's hand in the 1930s. And this theory does have genetic ammunition behind it, the 22.2% E1B1B-M293 frequency from the Trombetta data. A Nilo-Saharan-linked autosomal component measured at roughly 14.9% in Tutsi samples versus about 4.3% in Hutu samples, and the lactase persistence figures sitting right alongside it. But the theory runs into a wall almost immediately. Broader Y chromosome data across mixed Hutu-Tutsi populations, Tishkoff and colleagues, 2009, found that population to be overwhelmingly Bantu in origin, roughly 80% one single Bantu-associated marker, with the Afro-Asiatic linked component making up only about 17.7% of the total picture. Not a quarter, not a third. 17% in the combined sample, a minority thread, not a separate population wholesale replacing anyone. Look at one marker in isolation, and you get a dramatic, clean, 22 versus 0 split. Look at the full genome, and the distinct invading population story shrinks by an order of magnitude. And there's a detail this theory can't explain at all. The Twa, the oldest population in the region, the group that's been in these hills the longest by a wide margin, show almost none of this signal either. If a pastoralist migration is old enough and thorough enough to leave a 22% mark on one group, why does it leave essentially nothing on the group that's had the most centuries of proximity to absorb it? A simple story. Outsiders arrived, became Tutsi, end of explanation, doesn't survive that question, which means there's a second, considerably messier possibility standing behind it. One that has less to do with where anyone originally came from, and a great deal more to do with what happened to these categories, generation after generation, over the 5 centuries that followed. That messier possibility has a name in the region's own oral and administrative history. Kwihutura, the process by which a Hutu family, accumulating enough cattle across a generation or two, became socially Tutsi, not through marriage alone, not through migration. Through wealth, recognized and re-recognized by the community around them, until the social label simply caught up with the herd size. The reverse process existed too. A Tutsi family losing its cattle could, over time, be reclassified as Hutu. Under this second theory, the categories were never fixed lineages waiting to be discovered by a Belgian officer with a ruler. They were positions in an economic system, refilled generation after generation by whoever currently held the cattle. If that's the real mechanism, the genetic signal researchers keep finding stops looking like evidence of a separate ancestral population arriving from outside. It starts looking like something closer to 5 centuries of selective marriage. Pastoralist elite families intermarrying preferentially with other pastoralist lineage families, generation on generation, slowly concentrating a minor genetic thread that was already present in the region, rather than importing a brand new one from somewhere else. The 17.7% Afro-Asiatic linked component that researchers found running through the combined Hutu-Tutsi sample in 2009 fits this model well. A long-standing regional minority ancestry, sorted and resorted by centuries of Great Lakes Kingdom politics, rather than the fingerprint of a single migration event. It is a tidier theory than the first one. It explains the social fluidity. It explains why Hutu and Tutsi share so much of their genome. It explains why the boundary always felt permeable to the people living inside it, even as it felt absolute to the people measuring it from outside. But it has its own hole, a hole the size of a percentage point. Here is where the second theory runs into the same wall the first one did, just from the opposite direction. Slow, centuries-long intermarriage between social classes should produce a gradient. Some bleed of the marker into Hutu families, some trace into Twa families, a blurred boundary that gets fuzzier the longer the process runs. That is not what the Burundi data shows. Trombetta's numbers are not a gradient. They are 22.2% in one group and a flat 0 in the other two, in the same country, in the same study. Centuries of gradual social sorting tend to leave smudges at the edges. This dataset has no smudges at all, so neither theory closes the case on its own. The migration theory can't explain why the Twa, the oldest population in the region, with the longest possible window to absorb any incoming genetic signal, show almost none of it. The social mobility theory can't explain why the boundary in the actual DNA is so clean, so binary, so resistant to 500 years of exactly the kind of blending it predicts. Something structured enough to hold a sharp line survived here, but something small enough to stay invisible in 80% of the shared genome survived here too. Both things, at once. Neither theory currently explains both. There is a third possibility, and it is the one researchers tend to raise carefully, almost reluctantly, because of where it points next. The third theory says the marker was never about a population at all. It was about a lineage, a small one, possibly numbering in the low thousands rather than tens of thousands, arriving not as one dramatic migration but trickling in across a few generations, and then, this is the key mechanism, becoming concentrated almost entirely inside an elite, endogamous class that intermarried overwhelmingly with itself. Burundi's own royal structure gives this theory a very specific place to live. The Ganwa, the princely caste that ruled above both Hutu and Tutsi commoners. whose marriage practices were famously restrictive, famously closed. A small founding lineage, locked inside a small ruling class, marrying inward for generations, would produce exactly the pattern the data shows. Near total presence in the elite, near total absence everywhere else. No gradient because there was almost no mixing to produce one. This model does something the other two can't. It explains the sharp on-off switch without requiring a mass invasion, and without requiring 5 centuries of blending that the data doesn't actually show. And it recasts the colonial ID card episode in an uncomfortable new light. The Belgian officers with their calipers and their cattle ledgers may not have been inventing something from absolutely nothing. They may have been crudely, brutally, ignorantly measuring the edge of something that had a real, narrow thread of truth running through it, and then doing what colonial administrations do best, taking a small, specific, genuinely researchable signal and hardening it into an absolute, racialized, weaponized caste system that the actual biology never remotely justified. Researchers are careful here, and they should be. The sample sizes behind all of this, Trombetta's Burundian cohort included, are small. Dozens of individuals, not thousands. A small founder lineage model is plausible. It is not proven. And there's a gap in the evidence that no one currently studying this can close. No ancient DNA study has yet tested pre-colonial skeletal remains from the Great Lakes region directly. The timing question, how old this signal actually is, whether it arrived in the 1500s or the 500s or earlier, remains, as of now, unanswered by direct physical evidence. Every theory on the table is being built from present-day blood, reasoning backward into a past no one has yet excavated. Picture the hills above Lake Tanganyika, several centuries before any of this was written down in a colonial ledger. The Kingdom of Burundi is already old here, its royal court structured around the Ganwa princely families, who sit above both farmer and herder alike. Cattle are not simply livestock in this world. Cattle are the currency of the kingdom itself. Counted, loaned between families as political alliance, inherited as the clearest form of wealth a person can hold. A farming family that manages, over 1 or 2 generations, to build a large enough herd does not stay a farming family forever. Their grandchildren may be recognized, by the community around them, as something else entirely. The boundary moves. It moves because of cows, not blood. Now place a colonial officer in that same landscape, centuries later holding a pair of calipers and a cattle ledger of his own. He takes the same currency, cattle count, that this society had used for generations as a living, shifting marker of status, and he freezes it. One measurement, one date, one card, printed once, that will never update again no matter how many cattle a person's grandchildren come to own or lose. The fluid, locally understood system that had let people move between categories for half a millennium gets replaced, in a single colonial stroke, by something that cannot move at all. So here is everything, laid on the table at once. This was never really a question of whether Hutu and Tutsi were always separate races, because they weren't. It was never really a question of whether the divide was 100% colonial invention either, because the data won't support that clean an answer. The real question, the one this evidence keeps circling back to, is how a real, narrow, ancient genetic signal survived underneath centuries of social reclassification, only to be seized by people who understood none of its actual size or meaning and turned into justification for mass violence. The twist is a matter of scale, not existence. A genetic thread running through roughly a fifth of one group, sitting inside a genome that is otherwise more than 80% shared with the very neighbors it was used to separate. That thread was simultaneously real enough to measure in a laboratory in 2015, far too small to justify any hierarchy built on top of it, and, once racialized by a ruler in a cattle ledger, large enough to help fuel Burundi's own mass killings in 1972 and 1993, and the genocide that followed next door in Rwanda in 1994. Not invented, not destiny, something in between, weaponized by people who needed a simple story more than they needed an accurate one. And underneath all of it sits the group this story keeps almost forgetting. The Twa, genetically closer to Central African forager populations than to either Hutu or Tutsi, present in these hills longer than anyone else by a wide margin, appear in neither the elite pastoralist theory nor the reconciliation narrative that followed the violence. They make up roughly 1% of Burundi's population today. They remain largely excluded from land ownership, from political representation, from the story itself. A researcher working through this material once put it plainly to a colleague: the deepest layer of this history belongs to the group everyone keeps writing out of the frame. No ancient DNA has yet been recovered from pre-colonial remains in this region to settle when any of this began. That is not a gap in the storytelling. It is a gap in the science itself, and it means the precise origin of what a colonial ledger once called Tutsi and Hutu remains, honestly unresolved. Widen the lens, and Burundi stops looking like an isolated case. Nearly every rigid modern ethnic category, examined closely enough with modern genetics, turns out to follow some version of the same pattern, a real but modest ancestral thread, picked up by later political and colonial machinery, and hardened into something far more absolute than the underlying biology ever supported. Burundi is simply one of the clearest examples on record, because the measuring here was so literal, so recent, so well documented. Cattle counts and nose-length calipers within living memory, on paper that still exists. A ledger like that doesn't disappear once the ink dries. It sits in an archive somewhere, one column of numbers standing in for a history that was never that simple to begin with. A single frozen page trying to hold a river that had been moving, quietly, for 500 years before anyone thought to write it down. The Burundian were never who we thought. Not the invented ethnicity of the textbooks, and not the fixed races of the colonial ledgers either. DNA didn't resolve who they are. It only proved the question was always larger than anyone, colonizer or academic, was willing to admit.